My name is Tom Parker, and I'm the Director of Security Consulting Services for Securicon. We're a small boutique practice right outside of DC. Do a lot of work with the federal government, who have a diverse set of requirements and so forth. And so attribution is a topic which is very near and dear to me and a lot of the people that I do work with on a daily basis. Today we're going to be talking about attribution as a high-level topic, in addition to delving into some of the intricacies of how we might be able to achieve attribution, some of what's been done in the past, some of the limitations with the tool set that we currently have today. Greg Hogland did a great talk earlier today on malware analysis, and we're going to look at some of the concepts that he put forward in a bit of a broader purview to try and rate an attack and a piece of malware and some other components associated with attacks, using some existing methodologies for analysis and some new technologies which I've conceived over the last couple of months. There will be a tool release in accompanying this presentation, which I'll provide you all a link for. One final note: these slides have changed slightly from what you have on your CDs. So I was thinking that we still had those big, thick books that you could use for doorstops at Black Hat, but I guess they've stopped giving those out now. So. But if you do have the CD up, the presentation on a laptop, it will deviate slightly from what I'm about to show you. So attribution is really become a top-of-mind topic over the last couple of years, specifically because the media has started paying a lot more attention to purported nation-state sponsored efforts, organized crime, various botnets which have gleaned a lot of media attention. The Wall Street Journal, about 16 to 18 months ago now, published a talk entitled Wide Cyber Attacks Linked to China, which is very speculative in nature, and what it basically said was that the Chinese are responsible for all kinds of badness against the defense industrial base, or DIB as we call it in DC, which is basically a term for the big contractors that do a lot of the work for the Defense Department and intelligence communities. 60 Minutes had a piece probably about 12 months ago now called Sabotaging the Systems, where they were talking about control systems. Again, there are a lot of inferences around that regarding what could possibly have been state-sponsored attacks. The Google Aurora incident, is there anyone in this room who hasn't heard of the Aurora attacks? Okay, good. Well, the media is doing its job, I guess. Aurora was, a huge incident, got lots of publicity, lots of speculation concerning who it may have been, whether it was the Chinese or perhaps a smaller group of individuals. And then most recently, there's been a lot of press around the SCADA malware that's been given the name Stuxnet, which targeted Siemens SCADA systems, specifically an HMI component. And again, there's been a lot of speculation around that and whether it was potentially state-sponsored. There's been a lot of infections in Iran and other countries in the Middle East, so there's even been some speculation that it may have been us that created that. So we're actually going to look closely at Stuxnet later on and use some of the characterization matrices against Stuxnet to try and determine a little more about Stuxnet as a piece of code rather than just the functionality that's immediately obvious. So one of the big problems that we face in the cybersecurity community, it's not just information warfare that faces this, is a lack of a common lexicon. This is especially an issue if you look at the technical communities and the defense communities. Everyone seems to use similar language to describe different things, and there's a very similar problem in the information warfare space. Of most note, the word cyber war means a lot of different things to different people. I like to take the approach that if you take a look at what cyber war really means from a literal standpoint, an act of war is a legal state between two nation states. So it's not really a term that people should use lightly. I know what they mean. They mean cyber warfare as a tactic. But if you see an article entitled War Between the US in another country, that invokes a lot of thought in terms of other potential side effects of that, so maybe even a kinetic war that might accompany it. So in a lot of the working groups that I'm a member of, we like to call it cyber conflict to describe the more peacetime but clandestine operations that we think various countries may be involved with against each other. In this talk, when we talk about an adversary or an actor or attribution, what we're going to be talking about is not necessarily finding an individual's home address, what they eat for dinner, when they go to sleep, but we're also going to be talking about attribution on the level of the state level, so state-sponsored capabilities, as opposed to individuals within maybe a state-sponsored unit. We're going to look in a minute about some of the reasons that we don't really often care about the individuals behind the attack. And finally, since it's all over the press, I wanted to mention APT, or Advanced Persistent Threat, or Average Persistent Threat, as some of my colleagues jokingly call it. To different people, APT means different things. I've heard 1,000 different explanations for what an APT is. It's certainly not a term I'm going to be using now, and I would encourage anyone that has a technical conversation with anyone about advanced persistent threats to ask them what they really mean by that, to talk about specifics rather than just using acronyms, which are often used as marketing tools these days in our industry. Okay, can anyone tell me what that is? While I get myself some water. No? There you go. Yeah, that's a, So this is a high magnification on some ballistics evidence from a fired bullet, and this is the same thing, looking at the back of where the firing pin is hit. And the point of these slides is really to demonstrate that a lot of the technologies that we have today just tell us, or are akin to telling us that the guy was shot. Well, great. What kind of gun was he shot with? Where was it manufactured? Maybe we can figure out what the serial number of that weapon was. There's a lot of information that we could be deriving from a lot of the attack analysis data that is available to us today, but we're really not taking full advantage of. And there's a lot of research in the forensic space for profiling and characterizing common criminals in the kinetic world, but we really don't have that body of research in the cyberspace right now. So why do we care about attribution? First and foremost, and perhaps most obviously, as a law enforcement tool and as a deterrent. It's a fact that the more people that get caught for crimes, the less people that are inclined to commit them. Obviously, the law enforcement community in cyber investigations rely heavily on the ability to attribute attacks to individuals for purposes of catching the person that did it. But perhaps most importantly, in terms of actor intelligence, as a tool for any kind of investigative organization, whether it be the intelligence community, whether you're a large bank, being able to attribute the attacks that are being targeted against your systems, or at least building up a knowledge base on what's important about those attacks, is very important in terms of profiling our adversaries' capabilities and how we might be able to develop countermeasures to address those. It's also very important to be able to create linkage between actor groups, and I think Greg was perhaps talking about this a little bit earlier on. But being able to say that, okay, 12 months ago we saw this attack over here, it attacked this system, it used an agent rootkit that we haven't seen anywhere else, we don't believe it's commercially available for sale, and then saying, well, 12 months later we saw this attack over here and we think that it's probably state-sponsored because of these other attributes, and they use the same technology. It's very important to be able to create that linkage between the two incidents, and therefore potentially track the supply chain through which the adversaries in the latter attack were able to acquire that technology. So to step back and talk about the point that I touched on earlier, what are we looking for when we talk about attribution? Well, the obvious is an individual that kicked off an attack, who they are, where they live, their geographical presence, what their motive was behind the attack, what their capabilities are, but we're not necessarily just looking at that. We're also interested in actor-level groups in terms of what the high-level capabilities are of a nation-state organization, the budget that they might invest in certain capabilities, and so because of that, people think attribution and they think, oh, well, it's really difficult to find exactly who that person was. A lot of the time, you don't necessarily care, because having that higher level of information about the people that you're dealing with or groups of people that you're dealing with is often all you really need to develop those countermeasures. So again, one of the things we're looking to do here is to differentiate between different actor groups, identify groups by their geographical presence, any indications of sponsorship that we might be able to attribute, such as whether it was an attack from China versus Russia versus Korea. If it was the work of an activist group, you don't really hear a lot about this in the press anymore, but if you go back 5 or 6 years, you see a lot of cyber attacks that were mounted by people like the Animal Liberation Front, the Environmental Liberation Front, have been surprisingly active in this space. These days, all we're talking about is China, Russia, and people with Islamic persuasions that want to use the internet to attack our infrastructure. But there's a lot of activist groups as well that have also used cyber capabilities in the past. And again, identifying where worlds collide, identifying where two groups have shared a similar piece of code. Maybe they're colluding together on a project. Maybe those groups have joined together. There's various cases where hacker groups on the Asia-Pacific Rim have joined together to form teams and more formidable actor groups. So there's a number of conventional means that we use today, and some of you are probably very familiar with a lot of these methodologies: static binary runtime analysis, either where we're looking at a binary without running it through a tool like IDA, or through runtime analysis using a tool, again, like IDA, OllyDBG, WinDBG, or any of the commercially available tools. Memory forensics, using tools like Mandiant's Memorize, has become a lot more popular recently, especially with the proliferation of rootkits adopted within malware. Tools like Memorize that can look at the physical memory for inconsistencies in what the operating system is reporting versus what's actually there have become a very important part of the analyst toolkit. Being able to look at the vulnerability itself and the payload is a technique which is very commonly used today for purposes of developing IDS signatures. But a lot of those methods can also be used to help us with attribution, and we're going to be looking in detail in about half an hour about what attributes associated with the exploit and payloads we can really leverage to tell us a lot more about the adversary. Command and control is obviously something that a lot of people look at these days. The first thing that an analyst will typically do when they're running up a piece of malware in a sandbox is they'll look at where it's talking to and then try and establish what the architecture is. Command and control architectures are generally heavily tiered. That was random. And contain lots of different hosts. So if we can track command and control channels, that often helps us provide more information about the geographical location of the adversary. And again, post-exploitation forensics is very commonly used these days to look at the file system and what tools have been dropped on the file system. But again, not really with a spin around solving the problem of who it was and what their capabilities are. So if you think about any forensics analysis tool, whether it be a sandbox-based runtime analysis environment or a disassembler or antivirus, generally all of these technologies are aimed at answering one of a few questions. What it was that happened, how did they get in, what exploit did they use, what was done once they were on there, are they still there, and how can we prevent this in the future? And there's a good reason for this, because there's a big market in being able to determine what all these things are, because if you're an incident response group, this is probably all of these things are probably going to be the first things that your management are going to want to know, so that we can reduce the impact of the attack and hopefully make sure it doesn't happen again. However, none of these things are really conducive to the attribution effort. Again, antivirus is mostly based off of known signatures today. There are various